Hey people, how are you all doing? This is Ed from Last Lap Lion, and welcome to my review video of the 2023 Saudi Arabia Grand Prix. Okay, so going into this race, we had a couple of developments in terms of cars being out of position on the grid, which suggested that we might get a more interesting race with fast cars coming through the field. Obviously with Charles Leclerc having his 10th place grid penalty for having to change the battery on his third one, with only two of them being allowed for the whole season, and we're only in the second race. Going into the second race by this point, only had one race. So that's not particularly promising for Ferrari, it's got to be said. And the big one, in terms of causing a potential upset, Max Verstappen having his technical issue early on in qualifying, having to start 15th on the grid. So that was a nightmare for Max and a nightmare for Max fans and Red Bull fans, but for fans of the sport, that got a lot of us pretty interested in terms of feeling that we might at least have a decent race this time, with potentially not the same driver leading from start to finish, and potentially plenty of action with at least a couple of fast cars coming through the field. It also created quali itself created very interesting development with Fernando Alonso. Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin continuing their really strong early season form. First front row position for an Aston Martin since 1959, which was really nice to see a new name up at the front of the grid, and great to see Fernando qualifying on the front row as well. So basically, this was potentially a much more interesting race, at least on the face of it, going into the race start. Brilliant start by Fernando, leading the first lap of a race for the first time since back in 2012, which was great to see, and great to see the Aston Martins in general having so much pace. That was really nice. Really nice, made a nice change up at the front, even if it was obviously helped a little bit, made a little bit artificial by Max not being up there, since he might well have potentially been in front. But it was great to see Fernando returning to the front and Aston Martin appearing at the front. That was really nice. Great to see Fernando leading the first lap. Great passing move by Sergio Perez to take the lead early on. That was, although it was to be expected to a large extent with him being in such a strong, fast, dominant car, he did the passing move pretty well, although he did lock up and ran a bit wide, nearly enabled Fernando to come back at him, but that was all spectacular and nice and good and fun to watch, I thought. The penalty which Fernando Alonso got for being out of position on the grid, I thought was overly harsh. I think that I can understand drivers should ideally be in their grid positions perfectly lined up, but this is the first time I've really ever known, with the possible exception of Esteban Ocon's similar penalty 2 weeks ago 2 weeks before in Bahrain. I think this is the first time that a driver has actually been penalised for being too far to the side of his starting position. I could understand a driver being penalised, obviously, for being too far forward, which would effectively have the same effect as a jump start. But this situation with Fernando being a bit too much to the left of his grid position, actually, it didn't give him an unfair advantage at all. If anything, it actually gave him a slight disadvantage at the start, because over there at the extreme left is the dirtiest part of the track, dustiest part of the track, which is used the least. And also, it tightened the angle that he was going to have to turn into the first corner. So, if anything, he actually, although it was still technically an incorrect starting position, I think he compromised himself enough by that starting position being the way it was that a penalty was unnecessary, except for basically a driver, from the point of view of a driver not being perfectly positioned in the exact predetermined grid slot. But I think that if the stewards had applied a bit more logic to that, they would have seen that actually Fernando just did an amazing start, and his grid position being slightly incorrect in the way it was didn't actually give him any advantage at the start at all. If anything, it disadvantaged him. So basically, he just made an amazing start. And that penalty was, I thought, a little bit over the top. Very solid drive by Max to come up through the field, I thought. Nothing particularly unexpected or special from the point of view that his car had such an advantage. Obviously, he still had to stay out of trouble and avoid hitting people and avoid any potential issues which other drivers were having in the pack while he was in the pack in the opening laps, and find a safe place to get past people and so on and so on. But it was a solid drive. It was a solid drive up through the field, which was what you'd expect from the reigning double world champion. Fernando Alonso did a brilliant first stint, I thought. Really impressive for him to hang on to Perez's Red Bull and get the DRS from it. That was classic Fernando, basically. Using the technicalities and every possible advantage, gaining every possible advantage that he could, using the Red Bull to tow him down the straights and help him to build up a lead over the best of the rest guys following him. That was awesome driving. Real quality driving from Fernando. The safety car which came out when Lance Stroll parked his car, I thought was just completely unnecessary, because Lance managed to park his car completely off the track and even found a space in the barrier, parked in it. So basically, this kind of thing, if a safety car, if a car is on the track, obviously, then that's dangerous, potentially dangerous. Certainly if pieces of car on the track, absolutely dangerous. That really necessitates a safety car, but this didn't. Basically, I am struggling to remember any time when a safety car was more unnecessary than this, to be honest, with a car that's been parked not only well off the track, but in a parking space in a gap within the barrier. So basically that was a completely pointless safety car in my opinion. The shuffle of pit stops behind the safety car was not particularly exciting in terms of not really throwing up any surprises or anything particularly unexpected. It was a bit cringy to hear Ferrari messing something up yet again in terms of the strategy side, with Charles Leclerc's race engineer not advising him properly of what to do over the radio in terms of maximizing his race strategy, which was before coming in for the pit stop, which was another, well, slight mistake. Not as bad as some of the mistakes that Ferrari have made over the last 12 months or so, but it's something which hopefully will eventually get dialed out once Fred Vasseur has had an opportunity to have an effect on the way that things are operating there. So that was mildly interesting, I'd say. One thing which it did throw up in terms of potentially energizing the race was Lewis Hamilton being the only one of the front runners on the medium tyres as opposed to the hard tyres, which initially looked very good for him, with enabling him to overtake Carlos Sainz and also put in some impressive lap times and chase after the leaders. So that was something which looked good for Lewis, at least in the short term. But apart from that, and Max benefiting from the whole pit stop shuffle to gain a huge amount of time and some places as well, I think really nothing particularly exciting came out of that though. The way Max shot past George Russell on lap 23 had almost an element of comedy about it, because it was so much faster. That car was just so much faster than the Mercedes in a straight line. It was just a little bit unreal to see it. And basically it was like, well, like Crofty said in the commentary, and Martin Brundle's reaction as well, basically both spoke volumes, saying that it was like a different category. I completely agree, basically. That was just insane straight line speed that the that the Red Bull had and that it has this year. The situation between the two Mercedes drivers was interesting. I thought when Lewis caught George Russell and George actually found out that Fernando Alonso had served his penalty and then reacted over the team radio and then began speeding up and pulling away from Lewis, which was really massively impressive. It was another example of George Russell just driving amazingly well, and people really aren't giving him enough credit, I don't think, because he's driving so well and he's managing to, a lot of the time at the moment, beat and outdrive a 7 times world champion who's one of the greatest drivers ever in Lewis Hamilton. So for George to be driving so well against him is just amazing. And George Russell, I thought, drove an awesome race in this race. So, but that was an amusing kind of exchange that went on there, in my opinion. It was also interesting to hear Max complaining about issues with what he felt was the drive shaft in the second half of the race. So that suggests that Red Bull do have the potential for reliability issues with this car still. It's clearly been pushed close to the limit, close to the edge of the envelope of performance, and that has left the possibility for reliability issues, at least in the next few races before it, I'd imagine, everything gets sorted out. So that gives us, as fans of the sport who want to see different cars and drivers winning, at least, maybe a little bit of hope, possibly, that Red Bull might have reliability issues, which might take them out of races in the near future at some point, and the potential for somebody else to win, which is obviously something which is we want to look for. We don't want Red Bull to do badly as fans of the sport. We don't want Red Bull to do badly or their drivers to do badly, but we want to see close, exciting racing, and we want to see some kind of battle for the championship at least. So with Red Bull having such a dominant car at the moment, with such a speed advantage, kind of from a neutral point of view, from a point of view of anyone who's a fan of the sport, then that's something which sounds interesting. Well, it sounds interesting to everyone, but it's something which gives some positivity to people who don't want to see Red Bull winning all the time. So that was certainly interesting to hear that those issues are still kind of bubbling under the surface at Red Bull. One thing which was amusing, on lap 37, Red Bull seemed to invent a racing line, all of their own, through, I think it was, I can't remember, because with 27 corners on this track and so many of them looking similar, I have to say I can't remember exactly which one it was. I believe it might have been turn 17 or turn 18, but basically I'll correct myself if I find out which one it was, and then I will correct myself if I find out I was wrong, because I hate giving out wrong information in these videos and then not correcting it if I do. So basically the same thing, the same reason I wouldn't want to be told wrong things, I don't want to tell fans wrong things as well. So it was one of the corners in the second half of the lap. I believe it might have been turn 17 or 18, but basically both of them cut the same corner on the same replay, and it prompted Martin Brundle on Sky to say hello, which is a classic Martin Brundle euphemism, I think, for something amusing and interesting is happening. So that was a while since I've seen anything like that happen. A team who are leading a race inventing their own racing lines, changing the circuit layout. That was slightly amusing. I thought all the new drivers had a strong race. Logan Sargent, I thought, was really good this weekend, really impressive, including managing to control the spins he had in qualifying and keep the car out of the wall when he spun. That was very impressive, and he battled really well with the various other drivers towards the back of the field, and he showed good racecraft and good ability to spatial awareness around him and good ability to place and race the car. Also, Nick De Vries was impressive, effectively being a rookie. Obviously, he had the one race last year, but obviously with this being his first full season, he is basically effectively a rookie. And also Oscar Piastri. I thought all these guys raced really well and really started to show their quality as drivers for the first time. They didn't really, I felt none of them really had much of an opportunity to show what they were capable of in an F1 car in Bahrain. But here on a much more challenging circuit, I think they all drove really well and showed great potential. Pretty impressive drive by Kevin Magnussen, I think, to get the final point and managed to get past Yuki Tsunoda after Yuki drove so brilliantly in defense. So that was impressive. I think less impressive was Nico Hülkenberg. Generally didn't have great pace in the race and managed to hit the wall, which was fairly innocuous impact with the wall, harmless, but just hard enough to be noticeable and to look slightly embarrassing from the outside, it's got to be said, even though these are fractional misjudgments which are so easy to criticise. Well, it's so easy to criticise and so difficult to get your line right every time to avoid hitting the walls. So obviously that's easy to criticize that and easy to let your concentration lapse enough to bump into a wall like that. But unfortunately it's something which Hulk has done, certainly in races, throughout his career, and it's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of Nico Hülkenberg, at least in terms of driving talent. I've never believed that he's got what it takes to be a truly top F1 driver. And I was disappointed in Haas for letting Mick Schumacher go and signing up Hulk instead. I certainly felt that that was a step backwards by them this year. And I think that when you see things like that, it just vindicates that opinion a little bit. So basically, slightly disappointing weekend for Haas maybe, but at least they got a point and Kevin Magnussen drove really nicely. Sergio Perez was just awesome this weekend. Brilliant drive, brilliant pole position, brilliant race. Just drove faultlessly all the way through. Obviously, he did have the fastest car, but he drove it really well and did everything that could have been expected of him. Did an excellent job. And although Max managed to nick the fastest lap from him right at the end, so he got the extra point to just make sure that Max is that tiny little bit ahead in the championship at one point. Typical Max. But I really hope that Sergio Perez can raise his game this year from last year and challenge Max for the championship. I would love to see it happen at a time when Red Bull are not going to have, they're not likely to have much competition this year, certainly in the next few races, at least, possibly not for all season. So it would be really so nice if their drivers could have a battle for the championship all season and be much more evenly matched this year. I think that with Sergio building up his confidence, I think hopefully he can do better and better. Obviously, there is some precedent for drivers who are ostensibly number two in a team rising in stature and challenging their team leader. One great example was Eddie Irvine at Ferrari, obviously against Michael Schumacher, when he began to challenge him more and more as their time as teammates went on. And there are other examples where the number two has flashes of brilliance and occasionally wins the odd race and occasionally finishes ahead, but generally stays as a clear number two. And that's an example of that would probably be Giancarlo Fisichella at Renault when he was teammates with Fernando Alonso in their time at Renault in the mid-2000s. So it could go either way, but I'm really hoping that Checo can pull something out of the bag and challenge for the championship this year. That would be amazing. But his drive in this race was just awesome. Perfect. Excellent job. I think that the temporary decision to penalise Fernando Alonso at the end of this race, to try to penalise him 10 seconds, was absolutely ridiculous, for the simple reason that the penalty was applied far, far too late. Basically, waiting over 30 laps to apply a penalty, which was touch and go. I mean, it was only fractionally. I understand that rules are rules and they have to be followed, but it seemed like such a harsh decision to penalise Fernando Alonso 10 seconds for basically because the team just fractionally misjudged by 0.2 or 0.3 of a second their timing of touching the car at the end of the intended 5-second delay. I think that this type of thing really needs to be sorted out by the FIA. The FIA need to sort themselves out, basically, rather than applying these penalties willy-nilly. It feels like they're in danger of making farcical decisions and making races and race results look farcical if they don't get a grip on the way that they apply these penalties. Because certainly it would have been farcical if Fernando Alonso had lost that podium just because of something which wasn't his fault and which would have been, the penalty would have been applied far too late. So waiting over 30 laps before attempting to apply a penalty is just not on. I think the FIA need to sort out the way that they apply these penalties. So I'm so glad that Fernando Alonso, when he celebrated on the podium and had the interview and everything else, that it turned out to be absolutely correct, because the penalty was overturned and he kept the third place, which never should have been in question in the first place. So I think that Fernando drove brilliantly again. His pace throughout the race was amazing, and he just drove awesomely well. And I think that Fernando Alonso is just such a reborn driver this year. Reformed and reborn in and out of the cockpit, and I'm really hoping that soon he's going to get an opportunity to win a race, because I think that would be so amazing to see Fernando Alonso win a race for the first time for 10 years, basically. So I certainly admit I am a big fan of Fernando, because I see how passionate he is. I see how hard he tries, and I have felt like I've taken pain almost on his behalf for the last nearly 10 years when he's been struggling with uncompetitive cars. So to see him finally get back in a good car again is just a joy to see as an F1 fan. I think even as a neutral fan, as a Fernando fan, which I am, but also a neutral fan, I think it's brilliant to see him scoring these podiums, to get his 100th podium, and to hopefully have opportunities to win races this year would be amazing. So that's really great to see. Really great to see that Fernando has been driving so well in this race, and great to see him driving so well in this race, and great to see him get his 100th podium. So overall, I really enjoyed this race. I thought it was a fun race. It wasn't the most exciting race, but it was quite entertaining, quite watchable, and I felt always did have the potential to be more exciting. There was always potential for excitement to happen at any point, basically. It didn't feel at any point like the race was boring, or even the race for the lead was boring, like it was in Bahrain a couple of weeks ago. So it felt like a really fun, it felt like a quite a nice, enjoyable race. I've grown to, in the short time that we've been going there, I've really grown to quite like the layout of the Jeddah circuit. It's breathtakingly fast. It's always the speed that the cars go around all those various curves and corners is mesmerizing, and it was certainly the scene of one of the craziest and tactically one of the dirtiest races that, to be honest, that I've ever seen. Back in 2021, the debut race there, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to make a shot from that race the thumbnail for this video, is because it was such a bonkers race, and that's a race which deserves a review in its own right, to be honest. That's certainly an idea that I might make reality another time. So it's a really exciting, I think it's a really exciting circuit layout, which leaves you breathless. It's breathless to watch and ride on board with cars racing around it, with F1 cars racing around that circuit. I think that to drive it must be pretty special experience. So it's always it's always, in terms of the on-track action, it's one of the most exciting, but also one of the most races which makes me most apprehensive as well, because I realise that the potential for high-speed accidents is there, and obviously you don't want to see drivers or marshals or anyone else get hurt. So you balance that as a fan. I think you balance that excitement of wanting to see the on-track action with the hope that if there is any high-speed accidents, then nobody's going to get hurt. And yeah, you hope that nobody's going to get hurt. So anyway, I think this will be a good place to wrap up this review video. I am absolutely knackered, basically. I'm extremely tired. This is about, I think it's about 1:30 in the morning. So basically I've been up for part of the night filming this review. So I'm probably as tired as I get without falling asleep at the moment. So if you like what you've seen in this video, if you agree with what I've said, then like, comment, and subscribe. Okay, see you in the next one.